get to Waypoint 1, Dragon will be about 220 meters away from the International Space Station. So again, this is another checkpoint on the way to the International Space Station. And then that final checkpoint is Waypoint 2, which is just 20 meters away. And then from there, we will have that initial contact and capture, what is known as soft capture, before those 12 hooks, 2 sets of 6, deploy to have that hard capture. And then they can begin releasing those umbilicals for data and power, and then begin the pressurization activities for the vestibule, which is that area between the station hatch and the Dragon hatch that had been previously exposed to the vacuum of space. They'll conduct some leak checks, and then, of course, welcome the new crew aboard the International Space Station.
And yesterday when we lifted off, we were talking about the precise second that we had to lift off to be in the correct plane to reach the International Space Station today. And liftoff times are very choreographed, tightly choreographed to make sure we can do this. But once we get into orbit, it becomes a little bit different, right? And the timings of various burns, the timings of arrivals can all change. And that's basically because you've got Earth's gravity pulling on the spacecraft, you've got the moon, you've got some of the other planets, and the orbits, we do really good at predicting them, but once we see what the spacecraft is actually doing, it helps us refine those timelines a little bit like we saw today. And the timings of those burns changing a little bit, maybe not needing to do some of them if Dragon is doing really well. So it really is interesting how it shifts from super precise to now we've got to see what they're actually doing in space.
Typically, when we have a launch, we have what's known as a targeted docking window. So then, of course, it shifts a little based on those burns, whereas the launch itself is an instantaneous launch window, so it has to go at that exact minute and second. So again, yesterday's launch took place at 7:03 p.m. Eastern, 4:03 p.m. Pacific, and since then, Dragon has had about a 28-hour journey to make its way to the International Space Station. Dragon is now just about 330 meters away from the International Space Station. It's now inside Waypoint 0, approaching Waypoint 1, which is that 220-meter mark. And then from there, it'll continue on and enter inside what is known as the keep-out sphere, which is that 200-meter boundary around the International Space Station before we have that docking. So it's been a long journey for Crew 10 since launch yesterday, and even before that, because they had all of those preparations leading up to launch, getting suited up, those final medical checks, all of the various processes that they went through prior to that liftoff at 7:03 p.m. Eastern, 4:03 p.m. Pacific. So I'm sure they will be glad to be welcomed on board the International Space Station in really just a few minutes from now.
Yeah, and after that liftoff yesterday, and after the crew initially got onto orbit, there were some things that they needed to do as Dragon, configured itself for the orbital journey up to the International Space Station today. The crew got some time to eat, they got some time to rest and relax as well over the course of the last 28 hours. So it hasn't just been fully in their suits, in their seats. They were able to take those suits off shortly after liftoff. They are, of course, back in those suits now because during the more critical operations of spaceflight, such as launch, docking, undocking, and reentry and splashdown, we do have the crews in those intravehicular activity suits, or IVA suits as we call them.
So you'd mentioned a little bit some of the free time that they've had without those suits. They did have that sleep period. They woke up today around 8 a.m. Central, 8 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Central. So they've been up for about 10 hours or so getting ready for today's docking operations, but they did have that time to take a nap and get well rested and ready to be part of the Expedition 72 crew. And also on the International Space Station, not that long ago, the ISS crew was actually asleep right before we came on air. So they finished those post-sleep operations that they go through to start getting ready for today's docking operations. Again, NASA astronaut Nick Hague will be monitoring Dragon's approach.
And SpaceX Dragon on the big loop. Expect reconfiguration of C2V2 return link to support docking video shortly.
SpaceX Dragon, copy.
And that call basically saying that that C2V2, the common communication for visiting vehicle system that allows Dragon to talk to the ISS to talk to the ground, it just sort of creates some nice redundant communication paths for all the vehicles and all the teams involved today. That system was primarily configured for the initial approach of Dragon up to the station through Waypoint 0, and we just heard them briefing the crew that they'll be reconfiguring that again for the docking portion.
So we'll continue to hear a lot of those call-outs from the ground teams and the astronauts on the International Space Station, as well as Dragon, as we continue to get into the final stages of docking today. Right now, Dragon is about 310 meters away from the International Space Station and continuing to fly in to make its final approach and docking. So it's getting pretty close now. And there you're continuing to see, if you squint, you can see a view of Dragon there in the center of your screen. So again, these are views captured by cameras on the International Space Station. And so that is the Dragon Endurance spacecraft. And it's actually the fourth flight for that Endurance spacecraft. It previously flew 3 other commercial crew program missions, Crew 3, Crew 5, and Crew 7. And the fourth flight, obviously, today for Crew 10.
That's right. And overall, this is the 10th crew rotation mission for NASA's Commercial Crew Program that Dragon is flying. It's also Dragon's 14th human spaceflight mission to the International Space Station and Dragon's 16th human spaceflight mission overall, since Dragons don't always go to the International Space Station, but we have had 2 free flyer missions in the Inspiration 4 and Polaris Dawn missions as well. And with the Crew 10 mission, Dragon has carried 60 crew members at this point across its 16 missions.
And so, yeah, Dragon has had 10 rotational missions, so that continues to be part of NASA's Commercial Crew Program. We also have, of course, the Commercial Resupply Services, and we have the Commercial Earth Orbit Development Program working on potential future commercial space stations. So space is really becoming a commercial public-private endeavor. And you see that here as Dragon is docking to the International Space Station, obviously a government platform, but commercial partners bringing crew and cargo and things to the International Space Station. Again, once Crew 10 is on board the International Space Station, they will partake in a multitude of science experiments, technology demonstrations, all for the benefit of humanity. And so as Dragon continues to make its final approach to the International Space Station, now about 370 meters away, let's go ahead and turn it back over to NASA's Gary Jordan at NASA's Mission Control Center in Houston.
Hey, thank you, Anna. We are following along on the action here. Now inside the approach ellipsoid, we are in what is called joint operations. Both teams in each of the flight control rooms here in Houston, as well as where you are, Anna, at the Mission Control Center over in Hawthorne, California, with the SpaceX teams, are operating by the same joint flight rules. They're working through the procedures step by step, doing go, no-go polls along the way to make sure that all teams are ready for the next steps. The teams here in Mission Control Houston are currently polling to make sure that we can pass Waypoint 1 and go inside Waypoint 2. When we pass Waypoint 1, we're going to be inside what is called the Keep Out Sphere. Now, when we cross that boundary, there are a new set of flight rules to abide by and a new set of conditions to make sure that the crew can proceed all the way to docking, currently scheduled again for tonight at 11 p.m. Central Time, 9 p.m. Pacific. So the station is continuing to prepare for the crew's arrival. As I mentioned before, the station's solar arrays are feathered. We did configure the station itself to be in the docking attitude, and teams here are working through the C2V2 system, the common communication for visiting vehicles, power cycling that and make sure that data is flowing between the 2 spacecraft, the International Space Station and Crew 10 Endurance, and that the Crew 10, when it's on the docking axis right in front of the International Space Station going in towards the forward port, has a perfect view of the docking ring, of the docking port, the International Docking Adapter. And as it closes its way in, has all the data
Dragon is transmitting docking camera video. Please confirm video and data updating in the Dragon docking monitor.
That was Capcom Tess Caswell here in Mission Control Houston, standing by for confirmation from the crew aboard Endurance. This was the troubleshooting issue I was addressing with the common communications for visiting vehicles, power cycling that system to make sure that they could have that video once they get on the station's docking axis. As we wait for crew confirmation, we are getting video from the International Space Station's external cameras.
And Houston Station on the big loop, I can confirm I have good centerline camera. Station looks beautiful.
Houston copies.
Now it's critical that the teams communicate on this big loop to make sure all stakeholders are aware of the progress that's being made. That's cycling to enable Nick Hague, who's aboard the International Space Station. He's got a display in front of him monitoring the docking operations and receiving data from Dragon itself into the International Space Station. This is a safeguard. Dragon's rendezvous and docking to the International Space Station is a fully automated process. However, Hague does have an ability to execute commands if necessary, but really only there for monitoring. So that C2V2 power cycling allows him to have the view from Dragon itself as it moves up towards the docking axis, which you're seeing now on your screen from the external cameras aboard the International Space Station. Hague monitoring Dragon's arrival, receiving data including range and range rate, making sure that Dragon is moving at the expected velocity, speed, position. Everything's positioned on board the International Space Station for docking. Again, the station itself at the docking attitude. Now again, the station teams here in the International Space Station flight control room polling to make sure that Dragon itself can proceed past Waypoint 1 towards Waypoint 2. Waypoint 2 being just 20 meters in front of the International Space Station's docking port. This will be inside the keep-out sphere. It is Nick Hague monitoring the operations from the International Space Station. Now, once it makes its way in to dock with the space station, it'll be NASA astronaut Butch Wilmore that is tasked with the responsibility of opening up the hatches and preparing the station to welcome the crew aboard Endurance. This includes opening up several hatches, including the Node 2 hatch and the APAS hatch, both of which are closed for the docking operations and cannot be opened until the docking is complete. He'll start venting air to make sure that the air is circulating properly through the pressurized mating adapter. And there's no pockets of carbon dioxide, just a safety procedure. When he's going to inspect the hatch, he'll be wearing goggles and gloves for safety measures. We'll cover all of that post-docking, but that'll be Butch Wilmore's responsibility. We'll also be getting camera views from inside the station. These were set up by NASA astronaut Don Pettit. The crew waking up and making sure on an early day aboard the International Space Station, much earlier than their typical day. In fact, their crew wake period was just after midnight Greenwich Mean Time, which is the time that they operate aboard the International Space Station. They were up and making sure that everything was prepared for Crew 10's arrival today. Now we're making our way up the docking axis, beautiful views as Endurance makes its way above the horizon of the Earth. Again, it's making its way towards the docking axis. This is immediately in front of the International Space Station. The camera views from Dragon itself illuminating the solar arrays. You can see the original solar arrays of the International Space Station, as well as the IROSAs, the rollout solar arrays that are augmenting some of the station's power. This as part of a process to continue the science done aboard the International Space Station, which is, of course, the mission of the astronauts and cosmonaut aboard Crew 10. Crew 10 really just the transport mission to get to the International Space Station. Once there, they join Expedition 72 for at least a time. Don Pettit, NASA astronaut Don Pettit, will be returning aboard a Soyuz. Once that Soyuz undocks, crew on board the International Space Station officially begins Expedition 73, continuing the great science and technology demonstrations that are necessary in low Earth orbit to prepare for future human missions to deep space, including the Moon and to Mars. Camera views from inside Dragon Endurance showing displays that show some of the trajectory that is necessary to converge with the docking axis. This is Waypoint 1. Now, when you see those displays, you'll see the trajectory curve out, the spacecraft itself calculating breakout maneuvers that are necessary as it makes its way along the planned set of procedures and approach maneuvers. Waypoint 1 immediately in front of the docking axis. Once that is executed, the Dragon will fire its Draco thrusters to maneuver inside. We're inside 6 minutes from the planned arrival of Waypoint 1, continuing to get these fantastic views provided from the International Space Station, as well as from inside Dragon itself. Commander Anne McLean, as well as pilot Nicole Ayers, you see positioned as the camera in between them shows them in their launch and entry suits. We did hear before that they are allowed to bring up their visors through these set of procedures. Those suits are donned prior to joint operations, and they'll close their visors as part of the next dynamic phase, which will be the docking, which just as an added safety measure. Endurance less than 300 meters from the International Space Station, being illuminated by an orbital sunset right now. The views you see of Earth and of Dragon will start to get a little darker as we enter into an orbital sunset and orbital nighttime. Dragon, now brightened by the sun, will start to dim, and you'll start to see the docking lights as well as the navigation lights. Docking light will be white at the center of the spacecraft, and you'll see green and red lights on the forward bulkhead, green indicating the starboard position, red indicating the port position. The International Space Station cameras sometimes view from an upside down position, as you can see from this view, as the Earth is on the top left of your screen. So the port and starboard navigation light positions will be reversed, but it's because the camera is sort of upside down from the position of Earth. Additionally, the cameras on board the International Space Station are subject to the radiation environment of the station. Now, the station itself does receive a certain amount of radiation, but also a certain amount of protection from the Earth's atmosphere. As we are in low Earth orbit, 250 miles from the Earth is not terribly far. There's still a decent amount of protection, but there is a higher radiation environment. When we enter into an orbital nighttime, some of the cameras, you'll start to see some pixels, different colors on the camera. As we enter into an orbital nighttime, those pixels and different colors become a little bit more apparent. Those are from the radiation environment, the radiation damaging the pixels inside the cameras themselves. Inside 3 minutes from Waypoint 1 arrival, we do have a go to proceed past Waypoint 1. So Dragon, what you'll see is not a pause at Waypoint 1, but it should proceed towards the keep out sphere. You'll notice some of the views change throughout our coverage here. The feeds coming from Dragon, you can see illuminating the International Space Station. Those feeds provided by ground
SpaceX
stations.
On the big loop, approach 1 and soft capture ring extension will begin shortly. Dragon will continue its approach to Waypoint 2.
SpaceX, Dragon, copy all.
And that relayed from the SpaceX core in Hawthorne, California, confirmed by the crew aboard Endurance. We are proceeding inside the keep out sphere. You are seeing the docking light begin to blink at the center of Dragon Endurance. Features of Dragon becoming a little bit more apparent. The nose cone fully open, exposing the docking ring and the forward bulk of the Dracos. You did hear that Dragon will extend the soft docking ring mechanism. This allows for a cushioned contact as Dragon makes its way toward the International Docking Adapter. Docking comes in several phases, which includes contact and a soft capture, which is initiated by the docking ring. That docking ring is retracted to pull Dragon in closer to the International Space Station, and then begin a sequence to hard dock Dragon to the International Space Station. There are 12 hooks that are driven to really latch Dragon to the International Space Station. They're deployed in 2 sets of 6. And those will be confirmed by the crew. Once all of the hooks are driven, there is also an umbilical that extends and connects to an interface on the International Space Station side to provide power and data transfer between the 2 vehicles. Dragon right now operating on battery power and solar power that's generated from the trunk. Once Dragon attaches to the International Space Station, it'll be receiving power from the International Space Station through the duration of its stay aboard. We did hear confirmation that Dragon is passing Waypoint 1. So we're now moving inside the docking axis and towards the keep out sphere. Now passing Waypoint 1, Dragon Endurance heading towards the International Space Station. We're following along from here inside Mission Control Houston, working jointly with the teams in Hawthorne, California, to take us through the next series of steps, including crossing the keep out sphere and heading towards Waypoint 2. Let's send it back over to Anna and Chris in Hawthorne.
And thanks, Gary. Yeah, so we have passed Waypoint 1, so Waypoint 2 is what is up next, and that will put Dragon only about 20 meters.
Station Houston on the big loop, Monitor approach per step 3 of 1.102, Dragon approach and retreat monitoring. Let us know when your review is complete and you are ready for docking.
You heard that.
Station copies on the big loop, step 3, and I can confirm that review is complete and we're ready for docking.
So that call there between the ISS flight control room and the crew on board the International Space Station.
Houston copies. At Waypoint 2, Dragon will hold for approximately 5 minutes.
And you heard that call there indicating that the ISS
Thanks for the heads up.
and the crew there are now ready for Dragon's docking to the forward docking adapter of the Harmony module of the International Space Station. Dragon approaching Waypoint 2, which is the point about 20 meters from the International Space Station's forward docking adapter. And as we did just hear there, we are expecting Dragon to hold for about 5 minutes once it reaches that point. It crossed through Waypoint 1 and Waypoint 0 without having to hold. But again, these waypoints or checkpoints are places we can hold if we need to, and if we don't, we can proceed forward through them.
And so we have gone through 2 of those waypoints, so waypoint 0 and 1, and so now Dragon is less than 200 meters away from the International Space Station, about 170 meters currently away from its target of that forward node 2 forward docking port. And there you're seeing a great view on your screen of the Dragon Endurance spacecraft as it makes its final approach to the International Space Station. The teams in Mission Control Houston the teams at the International Space, or not the International Space Station, the SpaceX Mission Control teams behind us are, of course, doing some final go, no-go polls for docking. It's one of the final checkpoints between those teams to make sure everyone is good to proceed and to dock. We did hear that there will likely be a brief hold at Waypoint 2. And again, that Waypoint 2 is just 20 meters away from the International Space Station, so very close at that point. So they will hold briefly. And then from there, we will have our final approach and docking. We will have an initial soft capture. We did hear that the soft capture ring was being extended a few minutes ago. Mm-hmm. And then from there, they will begin to deploy those hooks, 2 sets of 6 for a total of 12 hooks to get that hard capture. And during that final hold, that again, we're expecting around the Waypoint 2 mark, which is 20 meters away from the space station. During that final hold, they can possibly wait for better lighting conditions. So the space station does have exterior lights and Dragon can dock in the dark. But of course, we go through an orbit every 90 minutes. So there's a sunrise and sunset every 45 minutes. So if they need to wait for a little bit of improvement in the lighting conditions, they can use that Waypoint 2 hold opportunity to wait for things like that, ensure final alignment, ensure everyone is good to go for that final approach and docking.
And as we could see right there, right before we switch to the inside view there, that's a great view on the outside. You can see that we're passing into an orbital sunset here, so approaching orbital night. And you can see how that lighting is very different on board the International Space Station. But what I love about that view, too, is you can see the forward navigation strobe light from Dragon illuminating the forward element of the International Space Station where it will be docking just a few minutes from now. But of course, approaching Waypoint 20. This is a view now from the International Space Station looking at Dragon. You can see the white navigation light indicating the center of the docking alignment axis there. And the green light that you see is the starboard navigation light. So just helping the folks on the International Space Station keep track of Dragon's orientation there. And the red one that just came into view is for the port side orientation. And I really love this too as we get into orbital night as we're approaching the space station, because we're probably going to see Dragon's Draco thrusters pulsing, and that's always a sight to behold in orbital night.
And so Dragon and the International Space Station.
Soft capture ring extension complete.
And we just heard confirmation that that soft capture ring extension has been fully completed. So that extension of the soft capture ring, it's fully out and ready for that soft capture, that initial contact with the International Space Station. So right now, the International Space Station and Dragon are currently flying over Canada. And they're continuing to make its final approach to the International Space Station, currently just over 100 meters away as it makes its way to that Waypoint 2, which is 20 meters away. So a little over 80 meters to go to the international, or to that Waypoint 2, and then that final initial capture, and then we'll have the hooks deploy and have that hard capture milestone.
Now, as you're looking there at the SpaceX Mission Control here in Hawthorne, California, where we are, Dragon up on orbit as it is approaching Waypoint 2 on that docking axis for the forward docking adapter. It's approaching the space station very, very slowly, about a few tenths of a meter per second, and it's also trying to keep in proper alignment with that docking port. But again, Waypoint 2 is where we're going to stop based on the calls, and we can do some final alignments there and final checkouts. But so far so good for Dragon. About 28 hours after liftoff now, after lifting off from the Kennedy Space Center yesterday afternoon at 7:03 p.m., completing the docking in just a few minutes from now.
And so Dragon is now less than 100 meters away from the International Space Station as it continues to make that final approach. And so right now we're seeing those live views of the SpaceX Mission Control team here in Hawthorne, California. And typically we'll go back to these views when we do have those brief loss of signal between the International Space Station and Dragon and the ground. And we'll regain those views shortly. It's just a handover between satellites. So that tracking and data relay satellite system that the International Space Station relies on, they have a brief handover period between satellites, which causes a loss of those views periodically throughout our coverage.
Kind of like going from cell phone tower to cell phone tower.
And so let's see, Dragon is less than 80 meters away, so continuing to approach Waypoint 2, about 60 meters to go until it reaches Waypoint 2. Again, we are expecting Dragon to hold at Waypoint 2 for just a few minutes to ensure final alignment, to ensure lighting conditions are good before we have that final docking. We are expecting that docking to take place around 9 a.m. Pacific, a little bit later than that. And right before that final docking takes place, we will hear that call for CHOP that we mentioned previously, which is the crew hands-off point. So right after you hear that call is typically when that soft capture takes place.
And that CHOP call that we've been talking about, and basically what that means is the crew can no longer manually abort Dragon away from the International Space Station if there should be a reason to do so. It would all be based on Dragon's automation at that point. Everything going very well for Dragon as it continues to approach the space station. The crew monitoring the automated approach for the vehicle, as well as any escape options they might have to do. But again, not expecting to have to use those.
Station Houston, on the big loop, the no exercise constraint for docking begins now.
Station copies.
And so you did just hear a call up from the CAPCOM, or capsule communicator at Mission Control in Houston, to the crew on the International Space Station, mentioning that the exercise constraint has started. So typically when you have visiting vehicles such as Dragon arriving and departing the International Space Station, there are constraints on crew exercise, and that's basically to prevent additional loads from being imparted on the station during these dynamic operations.
And I love this sort of night vision-esque view here from Dragon looking at the International Space Station. So this is a view from the Dragon Endurance carrying the Crew 10 crew. The forward docking port there is in the center of your screen, sort of being illuminated every few seconds by that light from Dragon. And what I love about this is you can see the Crew 9 Dragon directly above that docking port. And of course, Crew 9 going to be coming home after a brief handover period with the Crew 10 crew. And then inside of Dragon Endurance here, you have Commander Ann McLean on the left-hand side of your screen, pilot Nicole Ayers on the right. Next to Nicole is Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov, and on Ann's left is JAXA, or Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency astronaut Takuya Onishi. Ann and Takuya are returning to the International Space Station for their second long-duration missions, and Nicole and Kirill are on their first missions to space.
So it's getting pretty real for the 4 crew members that make up Crew 10. Right now, they are just under 25 meters away from the International Space Station, so just outside of that Waypoint 2, which is that point at which Dragon will hold for a few minutes.
Big loop. You see we're approaching Waypoint 2. Crew visors are closed.
Copy. Crew 10 visors are closed.
We did just hear that confirmation that the crew is approaching Waypoint 2, so they see that on those screens in front of them. They see the distance, and they're able to monitor that approach as well.
And this is great because you can see Dragon's Draco thrusters firing here. You've got the red and the green navigation lights as well as the white one, but all those little flashes and pulses that you're seeing around the vehicle are the thrusters, keeping that alignment as we continue to approach Waypoint 2, 20 meters from the ISS, where again, we are expecting to hold for a few minutes up. And you can see we're really getting close considering now we're really illuminating that forward docking port with Dragon.
And so Dragon is actually at that Waypoint 2 mark now, just around 20 meters away. So we will have that hold briefly. And recently, the team in Mission Control Houston did conduct their final go, no-go poll as well for docking.
SpaceX on the big loop. Dragon is holding at Waypoint 2 for Dragon Eye assessment.
You hear that confirmation.
Dragon's happy.
And you hear that confirmation that Dragon is holding. Now you're on the left-hand side of your screen as you're looking from the ISS's camera out at Dragon. Even though we've said Dragon is holding, you're still going to see some of those thruster pulses because holding in space is not like just stopping your car that holds the same position.
And Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Ground is bold go, and we'll be enabling approach shortly. Confirm crew readiness for final approach.
SpaceX Dragon, Crew 10 is ready for final approach.
And that is great words there to hear from SpaceX Mission Control.
Resume has been commanded. Reminder, once Dragon is inside the crew hands-off point, retreat and breakout are not permitted.
Copy.
And Anna, here we go.
So we did just hear that they have the go to resume final approach, so that we had that brief hold completed at Waypoint 2, which was just 20 meters away from the International Space Station. So Dragon will now resume its final approach and finish its fly into the International Space Station's Node 2 forward docking port.
And we heard
Dragon is in approach 2.
Your good confirmation of Dragon in that approach 2 mode, meaning it has passed Waypoint 2 and is coming into the station. Again, you can see
Station Houston on the big loop. Dragon is on final approach and is go for docking. Monitor per steps 5 and 6 in 1.102 Dragon approach and retreat monitoring.
Station copy.
And that was the call from the International Space Station Flight Control Room to the crew on the ISS. Again, just everyone confirming, making sure everyone's on the same page as Dragon is now very close to docking with the International Space Station here today.
And so Dragon is now just 17 meters away from the International Space Station and continuing to close in on its target. Coming up here shortly, we will likely hear that call out for CHOP, which stands for Crew Hands Off Point. That typically takes place less than 30 seconds before docking. So as soon as you hear that, you know that that docking will take place very soon after. And then at that point, when we hear the CHOP call out, any aborts will have to be done automatically by Dragon. And so also on the International Space Station, we have NASA astronaut Nick Hague monitoring this final approach. And then once Dragon is docked, NASA astronaut Butch Wilmore will walk through those hatch preparation and opening steps to welcome the crew on board. And Dragon is now less than 14 meters away from the International Space Station and continuing that final approach.
These very delicate series of maneuvers now. Dragon approaching very, very slowly relative to the International Space Station. Again, we talked earlier that launch is all about accelerating the vehicles to orbital velocity. And even though both Dragon and the ISS are traveling at about 17,500 miles per hour or 27,500 kilometers per hour, they are moving very, very slow, like 1/10 of a meter per second in relation to each other right now.
Dragon now at about 10 meters away from the International Space Station. We're standing by for that call out for CHOP here shortly.
SpaceX Dragon, 10 meters.
Copy, 10.
And again, you're looking at the forward docking port of the International Space Station, which is mounted to the Harmony or Node 2 module of the space station. The Crew 9 Dragon, which has been there since September, is also attached to a docking port on this module. And that Dragon is actually just off the top of your screen there as Crew 10's Dragon comes in for docking in just a few moments. And I love these views again. You've got the Dragon, you've got the ISS staring at Dragon on the left-hand side of your screen, and you've got Dragon looking at its docking port on the ISS on the right.
And Dragon is now less than 7 meters away from the International Space Station as it continues to make that final approach. Traveling with a range rate of less than 0.082, which, as you mentioned earlier, it continues to get slower and slower as we make this final approach.
Pretty good. 5 meters.
Copy, 5 meters.
So the next call we should hear is CHOP, or that crew hands-off period, followed moments later by docking.
That typically comes at about 2 meters away from the International Space Station. Right now, we're less than 4 meters away. Less than 3 meters away.
Pretty good. 2 meters. Clear hands off.
Copy, hands off.
There is the CHOP call.
Standing by for initial contact of Dragon to the International Space Station.
Dragon contact and soft capture complete.
And there you heard Dragon has successfully docked to the International Space Station. We have contact and soft capture confirmed. Soft capture meaning that the initial soft capture ring around Dragon has physically connected with the International Docking Adapter. And this is just the first part of the overall docking sequence, Anna.
And so we did have that contact confirmed at 9:04 p.m. Pacific, 11:04 p.m. Central, while both Dragon and the International Space Station were flying 260 stat sheet miles.
Capture ring retraction in progress.
Flying 260 stat sheet miles over the Atlantic Ocean, and we did just hear confirmation that that soft capture ring is now beginning to retract. So they're beginning those steps to firmly attach Dragon to the International Space Station so that we can have what is known as a hard capture.
And again, as we mentioned earlier, like all the timings of these events are a little nebulous and they can change around by a couple of minutes here. So while we were expecting completion of we're expecting the completion of soft capture ring retraction, which we heard was already underway in just a few minutes. That will be followed by the start of the hard capture sequence, which is a series of 12 hooks that are separated into 2 batches of 6 that drive between Dragon and the International Space Station to really hard connect them together. And then after we have that, we have a whole bunch of other things that sort of come into place at that point once Dragon is securely on the Harmony module of the ISS. Once those soft capture systems retract, the spacecraft will we're getting closer for the hard capture. And then and that's about a 15-minute process.
And so once those hooks are fully driven, so those 2 sets of 6 hooks for a total of 12, then we will see those umbilicals deploy. And again, that helps to hardline the data and power from the International Space Station to Dragon. And then the crew on the International Space Station, as well as Dragon, will get ready for the hatch opening operation. So they will have to pressurize the vestibule. Again, that is that space between the Dragon hatch and the Space Station hatch that was previously exposed to the vacuum of space prior to this docking. Again, we had that docking initial capture at 9:04 p.m. Pacific. So they will work to pressurize that space, perform a series of leak checks, and then once everything is good and they get the go-ahead, they will open those hatches. Again, there's the hatch on Dragon that has to be open, as well as the station hatch, to then bring the crew tent onto the International Space Station. And there you're actually getting a live view from the International Space Station looking at the station hatch that will have to be opened before you can get to the Dragon hatch and bring the crew on board. And they will be welcomed by the Expedition 72 crew. And they will have a brief welcoming ceremony, and then they will go into a safety briefing and get up to speed and adjust to life on station. Again, completing that handover period with the Crew 9 crew before Crew 9 returns home.
And then they get to work. because as exciting as the last 28 hours have been from launch until docking, this is just the beginning of a multi-month mission for Crew 10. They're joining the Expedition 72 crew, which has been ongoing for the last few months aboard the International Space Station. And about a month from now, when a Soyuz crew rotation from Russia completes, that will actually mark the start of Expedition 73, which our Crew 10 crew will be joining. And of course, there are about 200 science experiments that the crew will be performing over the course of their multi-month mission up there. And I can't wait to see it and everything that they're going to be able to do up there.
So they will be contributing to about 200 different experiments and technology demonstrations from human research. They're doing some flammability studies.
Ring retraction complete. Docking sequence is holding for MCS reconfiguration.
And we did just hear confirmation that the soft capture ring has been fully retracted. So again, that soft capture that happened with the initial contact about 4 minutes ago at 9:04 p.m. Pacific, 11:04 p.m. Central, as the International Space Station and Dragon were flying over the Atlantic Ocean. They are going to hold that docking's hard capture sequence a little bit to make some final configurations. We do expect that full hard capture process to take about 15 minutes, so we have about 10 or so more minutes to go there. The next step in that process will be to begin to deploy those hooks. Again, there are 12 total hooks that have to fully engage and really bring Dragon in for a nice hard seal to the International Space Station's forward docking port.
And sort of like a lot of things with spaceflight, docking is not just a singular instantaneous event when the two vehicles actually meet and connect with one another. There's the soft capture, which we're through with Dragon right now. There's also, like the vehicles are moving in relation to one another at docking, so they've also got to make sure that any motion between them is dampened out and that they are really ready for that hard capture connection.
And there you're seeing a live view on your screen on the right-hand side. That's a view from the International Space Station of the Dragon spacecraft Endurance, now docked to the International Space Station's Node 2 forward docking port. And again, that docking took place at 9:04 p.m. following an approximately 28-hour journey.
Station Houston, on the big loop, MCS configured, proceeding with hook driving.
Station copies.
And there we hear good confirmation that what we were waiting for there and holding the docking sequence has been, we've gotten through that, and now we are going to begin that hard capture sequence, and that's what you were talking about, Anna, driving the series of 12 hooks, 6 at a time, to form that hard capture. And again, we expect that process to take about 15 minutes, but it really is great to see the Dragon Endurance back on the space station. Its 4th trip to space. This particular capsule has launched the Crew 3, Crew 5, and Crew 7 missions, and of course returned those astronauts safely to Earth. And now it's doing it again for the 4th time for the Crew 10.
And it's the 10th total rotational mission for SpaceX flying crew to the International Space Station. Again, we did hear confirmation that the first set of 6 hooks for a total of 12 is now driving. So those will make a hard capture, and then they will drive the second set of 6 hooks. And then from there, we will have confirmation of that hard capture, and then they will deploy some umbilicals and then begin that pressurization and leak check series before we have hatch opening and welcoming Crew 10 on board the International Space Station. Of course, it's been a pretty long journey for Crew 10. They've been traveling for over 28 hours now, following a liftoff yesterday of 7:03 p.m. Eastern, 4:03 p.m. Pacific from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, Launch Complex 39A. They had approximately 9-minute ride to orbit before we had that orbital insertion and second engine cutoff, and then they've been traveling in free flight since then. They had a series of burns that set them up for a docking today at 9:04 p.m. Pacific. They first had their phase burn, and that was completed yesterday at 4:52 p.m. Pacific, followed by a boost burn at 12:08 p.m. Pacific, a close burn a little bit after that at 12:50 p.m. And then they had a mid-course out-of-plane burn, a transfer burn, co-elliptic burn, and just recently we had that approach initiation burn. So a lot of burns to set them up and get them on a track to where they are now at the International Space Station.
And after that sequence of burns, it went pretty good after that point. We saw Dragon cruise through the Waypoint 1 and Waypoint 0 targets of 400 and 220 meters, respectively, from the International Space Station, and then close into that Waypoint 2 for a brief hold, and then right on in for a picture-perfect docking over the North Atlantic.
And so we did have that soft capture at 9:04. Now the first set of 6 hooks has fully closed, and now the second set of 6 hooks is driving. Once that second and final set of hooks finishes closing and driving, we will have that hard capture complete. And then from there, they will, of course, begin the pressurization process of the vestibule.
And of course, part of Crew 10's arrival at the space station means that it's time for another crew who's been up there for a few months to come on home. So a few days after Crew 10, now that Crew 10 has docked, in a few days we will have the planned undocking and return of Crew 9, which includes NASA astronauts Nick Hague, Butch Wilmore, and Sunita Williams, as well as Roscosmos cosmonaut Alexander Gorbanov. 2 of them have been up there since September. Nick and Alexander launched on Crew 9 in September on the Crew 9 mission from Slick 40 at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. And of course, Butch and Sunny were already on the space station and joined Crew 9 and will now be coming home on Dragon.
So they will do that brief handover period. The handover period between crews is pretty typical. We like to ensure a continuous presence of U.S. crew, and then the Crew 9 will help bring Crew 10 up to speed as the new arrivals and get them adjusted to space station life before they return home. And so that second set of 6 hooks continues to drive. We had that initial docking about 10 minutes ago at 9:04 p.m. Pacific, and typically it takes about 15 minutes to have hard capture complete, so we should be approaching that milestone here shortly.
And as all of that is happening and those umbilicals are being connected,
hard capture complete.
And there we heard confirmation that we do have hard capture, so all 12 hooks have finished driving. And then from there, the umbilicals will start to deploy, and that again